Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to tell you a very dramatic story. An innocent remark from a 5-year-old child has uncovered a secret buried for 6 years. You look so much like me. Just that one sentence left the most powerful mafia boss in the city speechless, and his runaway wife had to face the truth she had kept hidden her whole life. The truth about the child the man believed he could never have is about to be revealed. Please follow the story to the end, and don't forget to like and leave a comment with your city, so I know how far my story has progressed. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, and Mara had learned to love that smell because it meant rent money, because it meant Leo had shoes that fit, because it meant nobody asked questions about the woman who showed up 4 years ago with a baby on her hip, and a name that didn't match any paperwork on file anywhere in the state. She wiped down the counter for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. The lunch rush had thinned out. 2 truckers in the corner booth arguing about something on ESPN, an old woman nursing a cup of decaf by the window, and him. He'd walked in 20 minutes ago wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than her car, and every instinct in her body had screamed at her to walk straight into the kitchen and not come back out. She hadn't. She'd frozen instead, tray in hand, watching him fold his long frame into a booth like he owned the building, like he owned the street outside, like he owned the air everyone in the room was breathing. She didn't recognize him. Not at first. 6 years changes a face, adds lines around the eyes, a hardness to the jaw that wasn't there before. But something in the way he moved, the way he scanned the room once and then never looked at it again because he'd already cataloged every exit, every face, every threat, that part hadn't changed. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be. She told herself that walking back to the counter, told herself that grabbing the coffee pot, told herself that pouring his cup with a hand that betrayed her by trembling just enough to clink the pot against the porcelain. "Sorry," she muttered, not looking up. "It's fine." 2 words. That voice went through her like a blade through paper, clean and total and final. She set the pot down too hard. Coffee sloshed over the rim and burned her knuckle, and she didn't even flinch because the pain in her hand was nothing at all, compared to what was happening in her chest. She made herself look at him. Alessio Romano looked back at her with the eyes of a man who hadn't placed her yet, who saw a tired waitress in a stained apron and nothing more, who had no reason in the world to think that the girl he married 8 years ago in a ceremony arranged by 2 crime families could possibly be standing in a roadside diner in a town that didn't even have a real name, pouring his coffee with hands that used to wear his ring. She'd changed her hair, cut it short, dyed it a flat brown that washed out everything that used to make people stop and stare. She'd put on weight she'd never lost, the kind that comes from stress eating at midnight when the baby finally sleeps, and the silence in the apartment gets too loud to bear. She'd aged in a way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with running. He didn't know her, thank God. Thank whatever was left in this world that still listened. He didn't know her. "You want to see a menu, or you know what you're having?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Just the coffee." He didn't look up from his phone. "I'm waiting on someone." She nodded and walked away before her knees could give out on her, ducked behind the counter, braced both hands against the stainless steel until the shaking settled into something she could manage. Through the pass window, she could see Sal in the back, flipping eggs with his usual indifference to the chaos of the universe, and she envied him with a violence that scared her. 6 years. 6 years of motels and cash jobs, and looking over her shoulder every time a black car slowed down on the street. 6 years of teaching Leo to call her Marin instead of Mara, of teaching him that some questions you don't ask, of watching him grow up fatherless in towns she picked off a map by closing her eyes and pointing. And now Alessio Romano was sitting in booth 4, 20 feet from where her son was supposed to be sitting right now, because it was a teacher in service day and the babysitter canceled and Mara hadn't had anyone else to call. The door chimed. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. She knew the sound of his sneakers on tile, the particular rhythm of his walk, the way he always announced himself a half second before you saw him by saying her name, her fake name, in that bright, unguarded voice that only 5-year-olds and the truly innocent ever managed to keep. "Mom." She spun so fast she nearly dropped the carafe. Leo stood just inside the door, backpack half falling off one shoulder, hair a wreck, because Mrs. Kowalski next door couldn't braid for anything and didn't try very hard. He had a drawing clutched in one fist, something he'd made at the community center daycare, and his face was lit up with the particular joy of a kid who'd had a good day and wanted the whole world to know about it. "Baby, I told you to wait for me out front. Mrs. Kowalski said I could come find you because she had to go." He was already moving, already crossing the diner floor with the total lack of self-consciousness only a child has, weaving between tables like the whole place belonged to him, and he was heading straight for booth 4. "Leo," her voice cracked on his name. "Leo, come here." He didn't hear her, or he heard her and ignored her the way 5-year-olds do when something more interesting has caught their attention. And what had caught his attention was the man in the charcoal suit, the man with the dark hair and the sharp jaw, and the eyes that Leo had spent his whole short life looking at every morning in the bathroom mirror because they were his eyes too. Mara came around the counter so fast she clipped her hip on the corner of it, a bruise she wouldn't feel until that night, and by the time she got there it was already happening, already unstoppable, the way a car crash is unstoppable once the wheels start to slide. Leo stopped at the edge of the booth and looked up at Alessio with the frank, unfiltered curiosity that only children can get away with. Alessio looked up from his phone, mildly annoyed at first, the look of a man who didn't have patience for things that weren't on his schedule. Then he actually looked at the kid. Mara watched the moment happen in slow motion, watched the irritation drain out of Alessio's face and get replaced by something else, something she couldn't name because she'd never seen it on him before. Not in 8 years of marriage, not in the 2 years before that, when they were just two scared kids being introduced by their families like livestock at an auction. "Hey there, buddy." Alessio's voice had changed. Softer. Careful, the way you talk to something small and breakable. "You lost?" "No." Leo grinned, gap-toothed, missing the front one he'd knocked out on the playground slide 2 months back. "I'm not lost. My mom works here." "Yeah?" Alessio's eyes flicked up, found Mara standing 3 feet away with her whole body locked rigid, and something passed over his face. Recognition, maybe, the first real flicker of it, like a man squinting at a photograph trying to place a face he half remembers from another life. "Leo, sweetheart, come on, let's let the man finish his coffee." She reached for her son's shoulder, and her hand was shaking so badly she nearly missed. Leo twisted away from her, not out of defiance, just the easy, oblivious motion of a kid who wasn't done with what he was doing. He was staring at Alessio now, with the open, unblinking focus he usually reserved for cartoons and bugs he found in the yard. "You look just like me," he said. The diner went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with the air pressure dropping, the way it does before a storm splits a sky open. Alessio's jaw went tight. His eyes, Leo's eyes, the exact same shade of near black brown, the exact same heavy lashes that made strangers ask if he was wearing eyeliner as a teenager, moved from the boy's face to Mara's, and back again, like he was trying to solve some equation that refused to balance. "What's your name?" Alessio asked. His voice had gone very, very quiet. "Leo." "How old are you, Leo?" 5? He held up a hand, fingers splayed, double-checked it with a frown, then nodded, satisfied. 5.5. Mara felt the floor tilt under her. 5.5. Alessio could do that math. Anyone could do that math. 8 years married, 6 years gone, 5.5 years old. The timeline collapsed in on itself like a building losing its foundation, and she watched it happen on his face in real time, watched him count backward, watched the number land somewhere that made his whole body go very, very still. "Leo." Her voice came out as barely more than breath. "Come here. Now." This time he heard the tone, the one she almost never used, and his face crumpled a little, confused, like he'd done something wrong and didn't know what. He came to her finally, let her pull him against her hip, his small body warm and solid, and the only true thing in a room that had just turned into a minefield. "I'm sorry," she said to Alessio, not looking at him, looking at a point somewhere over his shoulder. "He doesn't usually bother customers." "He's not bothering me." She made herself walk away. made herself put one foot in front of the other, made herself get Leo settled in the back booth with his backpack and a coloring sheet and a promise of chocolate milk, made her hands work well enough to pour the milk without spilling it, even though every cell in her body was screaming, "Run, just run, grab him and run out the back door and don't stop until you hit the state line." She couldn't run. Not in front of him. Not without making it worse, confirming whatever suspicion was already detonating behind those dark eyes. She went back to work, refilled the trucker's coffee, rang up the old woman's check. Did everything a normal waitress on a normal Tuesday would do, while behind her she could feel Alessio Romano's eyes on her back like 2 points of heat, like a gun being aimed and not yet fired. When she finally had no more excuses not to go back to booth 4, she went. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, and her professional voice almost held. He was looking at his phone again, or pretending to. "Your kid, Leo, where's his father?" The question hit her like a slap, precise and intentional. She kept her face arranged into the bored half-smile of a woman who'd answered nosy customer questions 1,000 times before. "Not in the picture. Never. Look, I don't really—" "He's got your eyes." Alessio set the phone down, finally, and looked at her directly, fully, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to since she'd first poured his coffee. "No, he doesn't. He's got someone else's eyes. Someone else's whole face, actually." Her pulse hammered so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "Lots of kids look like lots of people. That's not really—" "What's your name?" "It's on my tag." She touched the plastic pin on her chest, the one that said Marin in cheap engraved letters, the one she'd worn for 4 years like a mask grafted onto her skin. "That's not what I asked." The diner door chimed again. 2 men in dark jackets stepped in, scanned the room with the same trained efficiency Alessio had used 20 minutes earlier, and one of them caught Alessio's eye and gave a small nod toward the parking lot, the universal signal of a schedule that wouldn't bend even for moments like this one. Alessio didn't look away from her. Not yet. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a card, set it on the table between them with 2 fingers, deliberate, like he was placing a chess piece. "I'm staying at the Marriott off the interstate. Couple weeks, maybe longer, depending on business." A pause that felt like it lasted an hour. "I'd like to come back, talk to your boy again if that's all right." "I don't think that's a good idea." I didn't ask if it was a good idea. His voice stayed soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. "I asked if it was all right." She stared at the card without picking it up. Her name, her real name, the one nobody in this town had spoken aloud in 4 years, sat unspoken in the 3 feet of air between them, and she understood with a cold, sinking certainty that he hadn't placed her yet, not consciously, not with words he could say out loud to himself. But some animal part of him had already started circling the truth. The way a man circles a locked door he knows, somehow, leads to a room he used to live in. "I have to get back to work," she said. He stood, buttoned his jacket, dropped $200 bills on the table for an $8 coffee. The kind of gesture that wasn't generosity so much as a man marking his territory, letting her know exactly what kind of power had just walked into her small, careful life and sat down across from her son. "I'll see you around, Marin." He said the fake name like he already knew it was a costume. "Or whoever you are." He walked out. The bell over the door rang once, sharp, final. Through the window, she watched him cross the lot to a black SUV, watched the 2 men in jackets fall into step around him like satellites around a planet, watched the car pull out onto the highway and disappear toward the interstate. Mara stood frozen at booth 4 with $200 in her hand and her whole world rearranging itself around a single fact she could no longer deny. He was here. He had seen Leo's face, and somewhere behind those dark, careful eyes, the math was already being done. She turned around. Leo was watching her from the back booth, chocolate milk mustache on his upper lip, coloring sheet forgotten, his small face creased with the particular worry kids get when they sense something's wrong but don't have words for what. "Mom, are you okay? You look like you saw a ghost." She crossed the diner and knelt in front of him, took his sticky little hands in hers, and forced her voice into something that sounded like calm, even though calm was the furthest thing in the world from what she felt. "I'm fine, baby. I'm fine." But she wasn't. Because 6 years ago, she had run from a dying marriage with a secret folded inside her body, run from a family that would have killed her son before they let him grow up to threaten the wrong people's claim to power, run on the word of a man she'd trusted with her life. Vincenzo, Alessio's own uncle, the man who'd come to her in the dead of night with forged papers and a voice like ice water and told her that Alessio could never father a child, that the baby growing inside her belonged to a lie, that if she didn't disappear that very night, both she and the child would disappear permanently by someone else's hand. She had believed him. She had run because she believed him, because the alternative was staying and finding out the hard way whether he was telling the truth. And now the man whose ring she still sometimes felt the ghost of on her finger had just looked his own son in the eye and started, slowly, terribly, to remember. The card sat on the table where he'd left it, his name embossed in plain black letters, a phone number beneath it, an invitation disguised as a courtesy. She picked it up. Her hand was steady now, steadier than it had any right to be, because somewhere underneath the terror, a different feeling had started to surface. Something she hadn't let herself feel in 6 years. He was alive. He was here. And for the first time since the night she vanished into the dark, with nothing but a duffel bag and a heartbeat that wasn't only her own, Mara understood that running wasn't going to be enough anymore. Behind her, Leo asked again if the man was coming back. She didn't answer. She was still staring at the card, at the name, at the 4 words scrawled beneath the printed number in handwriting she would have recognized blind, in the dark, after 100 years. Find me. We need to talk. He knew. Mara didn't sleep that night. She lay on the pull-out couch in the apartment above the laundromat, Leo's breathing steady and small in the next room, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling shaped like nothing in particular, and ran the math over and over until her skull throbbed with it. 6 years, 5.5. The numbers didn't lie. They never had. And Alessio Romano was not a stupid man. He had built an empire on numbers that didn't lie, on ledgers and dates, and the particular arithmetic of debts owed and debts collected. He would not let this go. Men like him didn't let anything go. By 4 a.m, she'd made a decision and unmade it 11 times. Pack the car, drive until the gaslight came on, pick a new town off a map with her eyes closed the way she'd done it before. Or stay, because running had only ever bought her time, never safety, and Leo was getting older now, old enough to ask questions she couldn't keep dodging with the same tired answers, old enough to remember a town, a face, a name, even after she'd dragged him 1,000 miles away from it. She got up before sunrise and made coffee she didn't drink and stood at the window watching the gray light come up over the parking lot, and when Leo padded out in his dinosaur pajamas rubbing his eyes, she nearly came apart just looking at him. At the soft, stubborn line of his jaw that was Alessio's jaw exactly, that she'd spent 5 years pretending was just a coincidence of genetics, just bad luck, just a face that happened to resemble nobody in particular. "Is the man coming back today?" Leo asked through a mouthful of cereal. "I don't know, baby. He had nice shoes. Eat your breakfast." She dropped him at the daycare center with her stomach in knots, watched him run off toward the block corner without looking back. The easy resilience of a kid who didn't know yet what it cost to be looked back for. And then she sat in her car in the parking lot for 10 minutes with both hands on the wheel before she could make herself drive to work. He was already there when she walked in. Booth 4 again, like it had been reserved in his name, though God knew nobody had reserved anything in this diner since it opened. Same suit, different tie, the same 2 men posted outside by the SUV like sentries who didn't bother pretending they were anything else. She almost turned around, almost walked straight back out the door she'd just come through and called Sal to say she was sick, call somebody else in, anybody else, because she did not have the strength today to stand 3 feet from this man and lie to his face again. But quitting wasn't a luxury she had. Rent was rent. So she tied her apron and walked over, and she made her voice flat and professional even though her pulse was a fist against her ribs. "Coffee? Sit down. I'm working. I bought out the whole back section." He gestured, and she saw it then, the hand-lettered "reserved" sign on the 2 booths behind him, something Sal would never in his life have put up unless somebody had paid him an amount of money that made the question of dignity irrelevant. "Sit down, Mara." The name detonated in her chest. Not Marin. Mara. Her real name, said out loud in a public diner at 9 in the morning, said with the flat certainty of a man who was done playing whatever game he thought she'd been playing. She didn't sit. She stood there with the coffee pot in her hand like a shield, like a weapon, and looked at him and let her own face go hard, because Soft hadn't worked. Soft had never worked with this family, not once. I don't know who that is. Don't. His voice cracked like a whip, quiet but absolute. Don't you dare stand there and tell me you don't know who that is. I spent 8 years of my life next to that face. I'd know it in the dark. I'd know it dead. Her hand shook. Coffee sloshed against the lip of the pot. She set it down on the table hard enough that the truckers in the corner glanced over, and she leaned in, voice low, vicious, because she was not going to have this conversation in front of customers, in front of Sal, in front of anyone who could carry word of it back to people who'd be very interested to learn that Mayor Romano was alive and pouring coffee in a diner off the interstate. You want to talk? Fine. Not here. Then where? My break's at 11. He checked his watch like the 2 hours offended him personally, like time itself had started disobeying him the second he walked into this town. I'll be in the lot. She turned and walked into the kitchen and locked herself in the single-stall bathroom and threw up what little coffee she'd managed to drink that morning, knees against the cold tile, hands braced on either wall, breathing through her teeth until the shaking passed enough that she could stand up and look at herself in the cracked mirror over the sink. The woman looking back at her had circles under her eyes, dark as bruises, and a face that had forgotten, somewhere in the last 6 years, what it felt like not to be afraid. She washed her face. She went back to work. She did not look at booth 4 again until 11, and when 11 came, she took off her apron with hands that had finally, mercifully, stopped trembling, and walked out into the parking lot like a woman walking into her own execution. He was leaning against the SUV, jacket off now, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and for one disorienting second she saw him the way she used to see him, 26 years old and laughing at something stupid she'd said, before the families and the obligations and the lies had buried that boy so deep she'd started to believe he never existed at all. Tell your men to back off, she said. I'm not doing this with an audience. He said something low in Italian, and the 2 men retreated to stand by the building, out of earshot, still watching, always watching, because that was the only way men like that knew how to exist in the world. 5.5 years old, Alessio said. No preamble, no mercy. That's what he told me, 5.5. Kids don't always know their own age right. Don't. He pushed off the car, and the movement had violence folded into it, even though his hands stayed at his sides, even though he didn't take a single step toward her. Don't insult me. Don't insult yourself. We both know what that math says. What do you want me to say, Alessio? His name came out of her on its own, the first time in 6 years she'd said it out loud, and it landed in the space between them like something breaking. You want me to confirm it? Fine. He's yours. Are you happy? The words hit him like a physical blow. She watched it happen, watched the breath go out of him, watched his jaw work like he was chewing on something too big to swallow, watched 6 years of certainty about his own life collapse in under 4 seconds. You knew, he said, when he could speak again. You knew you were pregnant when you left. Yes. And you ran, with my child. And you let me believe. His voice broke, actually broke, the first crack she'd ever heard in it, in all the years she'd known him. You let me believe I couldn't have children. You let me believe that for 6 years. I didn't let you believe anything. I left because I had to. Had to. He laughed, and it was an ugly sound, nothing like laughter at all. You had to. There's always a reason, isn't there? There's always some had to. Don't you dare stand there and act like the victim. Anger came up through her so fast and so total, it scared her, burned away the fear underneath it for one clean, white-hot second. I was 23 years old. I was 6 months pregnant. I had a man standing in my bedroom at 2 in the morning telling me that if I didn't disappear that night, both me and the baby would disappear by somebody else's hand. You want to talk about what I had to do? I had to choose between trusting a husband I barely got to see anymore or saving my son's life. That's not a hard choice, Alessio. That's not even close to a hard choice. He went very still. What man? What are you talking about? Your family, Alessio. Somebody close enough to you to know things only family knows. Close enough to walk into our house in the middle of the night and not get stopped by a single guard. Who? She hesitated, and in that hesitation she felt 6 years of training scream at her to stop, to not say the name, because the name was the kind of thing that got people killed, that had nearly gotten her killed, that was the entire reason she'd spent half a decade memorizing exit routes in every building she ever walked into. I don't have proof, she said instead. I have a voice in the dark and a stack of medical papers I never saw a real doctor sign. That's it. That's all I had then. That's all I have now. What papers? Papers that said you were infertile, that said whatever the doctors found, there was no chance you'd ever father a child. I believed it because I had no reason not to, because the man who showed it to me had access to your medical file, had access to your house, had access to everything a person needs to make a lie look like the truth. Alessio's hands had curled into fists at his sides, and she watched something pass behind his eyes that she recognized from years of living inside the Romano world. The particular cold calculation of a man starting to understand he'd been played, and starting to understand exactly how badly. Vincenzo, he said. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. His uncle's name sat in the air between them like a verdict already passed, and she watched the last 6 years of Alessio's life rearrange themselves around that single word. Every quiet conversation, every piece of advice, every moment of trust extended to the man who'd practically raised him after his own father died, all of it suddenly suspect, all of it suddenly a different shape entirely. You don't know that, he said, but his voice had no conviction in it. You're guessing. I'm not guessing. I lived it. I had a man standing in my doorway who knew things about your medical history that only somebody inside your circle could know, and 3 days later I had a death threat and forged papers and a car waiting outside to take me to a bus station 2 states away. You want to call that a guess? Fine. Call it whatever helps you sleep. Don't talk to me about sleep. His voice rose for the first time, sharp enough that one of the men by the building shifted his weight, ready to move if needed, and Alessio caught the motion and waved him off without looking. An old reflex, total command, even in the middle of falling apart. I haven't slept right in 6 years. I tore this city apart looking for you. I had men in 4 states. I spent money I'll never get back trying to find a woman who didn't want to be found. And the whole time you were carrying my son, and you let me grieve a marriage instead of telling me the truth. I couldn't tell you the truth. That was the whole point. If I told you, you'd have gone straight to Vincenzo, straight to the man who threatened to kill us. And what then? You think he wouldn't have found a way to finish what he started? You don't know that. I know exactly that. Her voice cracked now too, 6 years of exhaustion finally breaking through the anger. I know what your family does to loose ends, Alessio. I watched it happen to people who crossed your father. I wasn't going to be the woman who trusted the wrong instinct and got our son killed because of it. Silence fell between them, thick and total, broken only by the hiss of a truck downshifting on the highway behind the lot. Alessio looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face had shifted from rage into something rawer, something closer to grief. Why a diner? He said finally, quietly. Why this town? Why not somewhere I'd never think to look? Because nobody thinks to look in the boring places. You don't survive by being clever, Alessio. You survive by being invisible. You weren't invisible to me. His jaw tightened. The second I saw your son's face, every instinct I had told me something was wrong. I just didn't want to believe it. Well, believe it now. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the June heat radiating off the asphalt. He's yours. He's healthy. He's smart and he's stubborn, and he asks too many questions, and he's the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I am not letting your family anywhere near him. He's my son, too. He's a 5-year-old boy who has no idea his father is the head of a crime family that's killed people for a lot less than what you're capable of. The words came out cold and deliberate, meant to wound, and she watched them land. I'm not handing him over to that world, not now, not ever. Nobody's talking about handing him over. Then what are we talking about, Alessio? Because you didn't fly out here, rent out half a diner, and corner me in a parking lot just to catch up on old times. He was quiet for a moment, jaw working, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped into something more careful, more dangerous in its own way because it sounded almost reasonable. I want to know my son. I want him to know me. And I want to find out exactly what Vincenzo did and why. And I am going to make him answer for every single day of the 6 years he stole from me. And what happens to us while you do that? You think Vincenzo's going to sit quietly and let you investigate him? You think he's not going to notice the second you start pulling threads? He won't touch you. You don't get to promise me that. Her voice shook now, not from fear, but from something closer to fury. 6 years of carrying this alone finally cracking open. You weren't there the night he came to my door. You don't know what he's capable of. I do. Alessio stepped closer, close enough now that she could see the muscle ticking in his jaw, close enough that the smell of him, cedar, and something sharper underneath, something that hadn't changed in 6 years, hit her like a physical memory she'd spent half a decade trying to bury. I will not let anything happen to that boy, he said, low and absolute, each word landing like a stone set into a foundation. Or to you. I don't care what it costs me. I don't care what it costs Vincenzo. I am done losing things because I trusted the wrong people. You say that now. I mean it now. You meant a lot of things 8 years ago, too. She hated how much that landed, hated the flicker of pain that crossed his face, hated that some small traitorous part of her still cared whether she'd hurt him. Things change, Alessio. People change, especially people who've spent 6 years building empires out of other people's fear. That's not who I am with him. You don't even know him yet. Then let me. For the first time, his voice broke entirely, the armor cracking all the way through. Let me know my son. I'm not asking you to come back to the mansion. I'm not asking you to be my wife again. I'm asking for the chance to be in his life, and I swear to you, on anything you want me to swear on, that I will burn down anyone who tries to hurt either one of you while I do it. She stood there in the parking lot with the sun beating down on her shoulders and the diner's exhaust fan humming behind her, and 6 years of careful, brutal survival instinct screaming at her to say no, to walk away, to get in her car and drive until the gaslight came on one more time. But she thought of Leo at the daycare table, asking if the man with the nice shoes was coming back. She thought of every birthday with an empty chair, every Father's Day craft project made for nobody, every time he'd asked why he didn't have a dad like the other kids, and she'd had to invent some half-truth to fill the silence. 2 visits a week, she said finally, her voice flat, final, a negotiation and not a surrender. Public places only. I'm there every time. You don't take him anywhere without me. You don't tell him who you are until I say it's time. Fine. And the second I think your family knows where we are, I'm gone. I don't care what promises you've made me. I will take my son and disappear so completely you will never find either one of us again. And this time I won't leave a card with a name on it. Something flickered across his face at that, something almost like respect buried inside the hurt. Understood. She turned to walk back inside, her break long over, her hands finally steady in a way that felt less like calm and more like exhaustion settling permanently into her bones. She'd made it 3 steps toward the door when his voice stopped her. Mara. She didn't turn around. Thank you, he said, for keeping him alive, whatever else happened. Thank you for that. She stood there a moment longer with her back to him, throat tight, eyes burning, and then she pushed through the diner door without answering, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't break her open completely in the middle of a parking lot in front of 2 men in dark jackets who worked for a family that had once tried to erase her existence. That night, Leo fell asleep on the couch halfway through a cartoon, his head heavy against her arm, and she sat there for a long time just watching him breathe, running her fingers through hair that curled at the ends exactly the way Alessio's had at that age, if the old photographs were any guide. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her pick it up, some old reflex that had kept her alive this long. The voice on the other end was smooth, cultured, familiar in a way that turned her blood to ice water before he'd even said a full sentence. Hello, Mara. It's been a long time. She didn't speak. Couldn't. Leo shifted against her, murmuring something in his sleep, and she pressed her hand flat against his small back like she could shield him through sheer proximity alone. I heard my nephew found you. Vincenzo said, and there was something almost pleasant in his tone, the conversational cruelty of a man who had never once in his life feared consequences. 6 years and you let him find you in a diner. Disappointing, honestly. I expected better from you. What do you want? I want you to remember our conversation, the one in your old bedroom. I want you to remember exactly what I told you would happen if you ever surfaced again. A pause, long and deliberate, the kind designed to let silence do the threatening for him. You should have stayed disappeared, Mara, for the boy's sake, if not your own. The line went dead. She sat frozen on the couch with the phone still pressed to her ear, the dial tone humming flat and endless into the quiet apartment, Leo's small body warm and trusting against her side, completely unaware that somewhere out there, in a world he didn't even know existed yet, a man who'd already tried to destroy his family once had just made it clear he was nowhere near finished. Mara didn't sleep. She sat on the couch until the streetlight outside went from orange to gray to the thin blue of almost dawn, Leo's body gone heavy and slack against her arm, and she replayed Vincenzo's voice over and over until the words stopped sounding like words and started sounding like something closer to a verdict. By 6 she'd made coffee she didn't drink, packed a bag she didn't fill, and called Alessio's number off the card before she let herself think twice about it. He picked up on the first ring, voice rough with sleep or the absence of it. Mara? He called me. Her voice came out flat, controlled in the way that only happens after the fear has burned all the way through and left something harder behind. Your uncle last night. He knew things, Alessio, things only somebody watching us right now would know. A pause, and she heard him moving, heard fabric rustle, a door open and close somewhere on his end. I'm coming to you. No, not the apartment. Leo's here. Then where? She thought fast, ran through the geography of the town in her head, every place she'd memorized as an exit route over 4 years of careful paranoia. There's a park 2 blocks east of the diner, 8 o'clock. I'll have Leo at daycare by then. 8, he agreed, and the line went dead. She got Leo dressed and fed and dropped him at the center with a kiss on his forehead and a held breath she didn't let go of until she watched him disappear safely into the block corner with the other kids. And then she drove to the park with her hands locked at 10 and 2 and her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds out of habit. Too old to break now. Alessio was already there when she arrived, sitting on a bench beneath a stand of oak trees. No suit today, just a dark jacket and jeans like he'd dressed for something other than business and didn't quite know what that something was. He stood when he saw her, and for a second neither of them said anything, just stood there in the cool morning air with 6 years and a phone call and an unbridgeable distance still sitting between them. Tell me everything, he said. Word for word, if you can. She told him. The smooth voice, the casual cruelty, the reference to the bedroom conversation 6 years ago that nobody outside that room should have known about. Alessio's face went through several stages while she spoke, disbelief, fury, something that looked almost like physical pain. And by the time she finished, he was pacing a tight line in front of the bench, hand pressed against his mouth like he was trying to hold something in. He's been managing my finances for 6 years, Alessio said, more to himself than to her. My investments, my properties. He sat across from me at every council meeting, every family dinner, every funeral, and the whole time, he stopped, jaw working. I need proof, something I can take to the council, something that isn't just your word against his. I told you I don't have proof. I have a memory and a stack of papers I haven't seen in 6 years. Where are those papers now? Burned. She said it without flinching because it was the truth and she'd made her peace with it long ago. I burned everything before I left the state. I wasn't running with evidence, Alessio. I was running for my life. He stopped pacing and looked at her, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Then we find another way. We? You think I'm doing this alone? His voice sharpened. You think I can walk into a council meeting and accuse my own uncle of conspiracy and treason without something solid, without a witness, without anything but a 6-year-old memory from a woman the family already considers dead? They'll laugh me out of the room, Mara. Or worse, they'll think I've lost my mind, and Vincenzo will use that to finish what he started. She wrapped her arms around herself. The morning had a chill in it that had nothing to do with temperature. What do you want from me? A name. Anyone else who might have known. A doctor, a nurse, anyone who touched those forged papers. She thought back, hard, forcing herself into a memory she'd spent 6 years trying to bury under new towns and new names and the relentless business of survival. There was a man. Came with Vincenzo that night, stood by the door the whole time and never said a word. Didn't get a good look at his face. It was dark, but I remember he had a doctor's bag. I remember Vincenzo called him Renzo or Lorenzo, something like that. Alessio's head snapped up. Renzo Castellano. He runs a private clinic 2 hours outside the city. He's handled Romano family medical records for 15 years. That's him. I'd bet on it. Then that's where we start. It took 3 days to arrange. 3 days of Alessio working channels she didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. 3 days of Mara going to work and picking up Leo and pretending her entire life hadn't been turned inside out by a phone call in the dark. 3 days of looking over her shoulder at every black car that slowed on the street outside the apartment. On the 4th day, Alessio called her with an address and a time, and against every survival instinct she had left, she agreed to go with him. The clinic was a squat brick building behind a row of dying hedges, the kind of place that existed specifically to be forgotten, no sign out front, nothing to indicate it served a clientele that paid extraordinary amounts of money to keep their business off any official record. Alessio's men had already cleared the front desk by the time Mara walked in beside him, and the receptionist sat frozen behind her computer with the particular wide-eyed stillness of someone who understood exactly what kind of trouble had just walked through the door. Dr. Castellano, Alessio said. Not a question. He's not seen patients today. He'll see me. They found him in a back office, a thin gray man behind a desk too large for him, and the moment his eyes landed on Alessio, his whole body went rigid, the particular stillness of a small animal that's just spotted something it can't outrun. Mr. Romano? His voice came out reedy, careful. This is unexpected. 6 years ago, you falsified a medical report. Alessio's voice carried none of the careful gentleness Mara had heard him use with Leo, none of the warmth she remembered from their marriage. This was a different man entirely, a man built out of cold fury and absolute control. You told my uncle, and through him told me, that I was infertile. That report was a lie. I want to know who ordered it, and I want to know exactly what was done to make it convincing. Castellano's face went the color of old paper. I don't know what you're... Don't. Alessio leaned both palms flat on the desk, and the movement alone made the doctor flinch back in his chair. I have men outside who would very much enjoy an excuse to make this conversation more direct. You have one chance to tell me the truth before I stop asking nicely. The silence stretched long enough that Mara's pulse started pounding in her ears, and then Castellano's shoulders caved inward, the posture of a man who'd been carrying a weight for years and had simply run out of strength to keep holding it. It was your uncle, he said, voice barely above a whisper. He came to me 8 years ago, right after your wedding. Said he needed a report that would convince you and your wife that pregnancy wasn't possible. He paid well. He always pays well. A bitter, broken laugh. I switched your samples with another patient's results. Low count, poor motility, the whole picture. It wasn't hard to fake. Nobody questions a doctor's word, especially not when the doctor has handled the family for 15 years. Why? Alessio said, and the single word came out cracked, raw, the first real fracture in his composure since they'd walked in. Why would he do that? You'd have to ask him. Castellano's hands were shaking now, visibly, on the desktop. But I can tell you what I overheard the one time he got careless after a few drinks. He said the Romano bloodline had room for exactly one heir going forward, and it wasn't going to be a child born to a girl from a family with no real power to leverage. He said your wife's family was useful for the marriage alliance and nothing more, and that her children would only ever complicate his own son's path to the council seat. Mara felt the floor tilt beneath her. She'd known in the abstract that Vincenzo had a son, a cousin of Alessio's named Dante, who she'd met exactly twice in 8 years and never thought much about beyond polite distance. She hadn't understood, until this exact second, standing in a dying clinic with dust motes hanging in a shaft of gray light, that her entire life had been dismantled not out of cruelty for its own sake, but out of cold, calculated ambition. Her son had been erased from existence to clear a path for somebody else's. Dante, Alessio said, voice gone hollow. He did all of this so Dante could inherit. That's what I understood, yes. Alessio straightened slowly, and Mara watched something close over his face, some door slamming shut on the last fragile hope that this might all be a misunderstanding, that his uncle might have some justification beyond pure, brutal self-interest. Will you say this in front of the council? On record? Castellano's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the parking lot, toward a world outside this office that suddenly felt very dangerous to exist in. He'll kill me. He'll kill you either way, eventually, once he decides you're a liability he can't control. The only question is whether you die a coward who let an innocent family suffer for it, or whether you die having done one decent thing. Alessio's voice had gone quiet again, but the quiet was worse than the shouting had been. I can protect you. Witness protection within my own organization, a new identity, resources to disappear completely if that's what you want once this is over. Or you can take your chances with Vincenzo finding out you talked to me today, regardless of what you decide. Because he will find out. Men like him always find out. The doctor's hands had stopped shaking, settled into the stillness of a man who'd run every calculation and arrived at the same grim conclusion Alessio had already laid out for him. I'll testify, he said finally. God help me. I'll testify. They left the clinic with a recorded statement and a trembling, terrified witness tucked into protective custody, and for the first time since the diner, Mara let herself believe that something resembling justice might actually be within reach. The feeling lasted exactly 4 hours. She was back at the diner for the evening shift, going through the motions of an ordinary Tuesday, when her phone buzzed with a text from the daycare center. Routine, the kind of message she got most days, a photo of Leo at the craft table, his tongue poking out in concentration as he glued macaroni to a paper plate. She smiled despite everything, despite the exhaustion sitting in her bones like wet sand, and texted back a heart emoji before sliding the phone into her apron pocket. 20 minutes later it rang. The daycare's actual number this time, not a text. Marin? The woman's voice on the other end was wrong, pitched too high, too fast. Marin, I need you to come down here right now. Ice flooded through her chest. What's wrong? Where's Leo? He's fine. He's right here, but... A muffled sound, someone talking in the background, urgent and overlapping. A man came to pick him up, said he was family, showed paperwork, said you'd called ahead to authorize it. I almost let him go before Mrs. Patterson recognized something was off and called you. Marin, you need to come now. The coffee pot slipped out of Mara's hand and shattered against the tile floor, and she was already moving, already tearing off her apron, already running for the door with Sal shouting something behind her that she didn't hear and didn't care about, because the only thing in the entire world that mattered was the 4 minutes it would take her to reach that daycare center and find out whether her son was still inside it. She drove faster than she'd ever driven in her life, knuckles white on the wheel, running a red light without slowing, and when she screeched into the daycare parking lot, she saw it immediately. The thing that made her blood turn to ice water. A black sedan parked at an angle near the entrance, engine still running, and a man in a dark jacket standing beside it, watching the front door with the patient, predatory stillness of someone waiting for a delivery. She was out of her car before it had fully stopped rolling, sprinting across the lot, and the man by the sedan turned at the sound of her footsteps, and for one suspended, terrible second their eyes met, and she understood with total, bone-deep certainty that this was not a misunderstanding, this was not a mistake. This was Vincenzo's hand reaching directly into the one place in the world she had trusted to keep her son safe. She burst through the front doors into chaos, Mrs. Patterson standing in the hallway with her phone pressed to her ear and her face white as paper. And beyond her, through the glass partition into the main room, Mara saw Leo standing frozen by the cubbies with his backpack half on, staring up at a second man crouched in front of him. A man with kind eyes and a gentle voice that Mara could hear even through the glass. Your dad sent me to pick you up, buddy. He's got a surprise waiting. Leo's small face was creased with confusion. looking between the stranger and the door, and Mara slammed through it with a sound tearing out of her throat that didn't feel human, didn't feel like anything she'd ever made before in her life. "Don't you touch him." The man crouched in front of Leo, straightened slowly, hands lifting in a placating gesture that didn't match the calculation moving behind his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm just here to get away from my son." Leo's face crumpled at the sound of her voice, the raw terror in it, and he bolted from the cubbies straight into her legs, small arms locking around her thighs hard enough to bruise. She got a hand into his hair, the other hand sweeping him half behind her, and her whole body had gone into a state she didn't have a name for, something past fear, something that ran on pure animal current. "Mrs. Patterson, call the police, now." "I already did," the older woman said, voice shaking, phone still pressed to her ear. "They're 3 minutes out." The man by the cubbies exchanged a look with someone behind Mara, and she turned just enough to see the second man, the one who'd been waiting by the sedan, now standing in the doorway blocking her exit, jacket open just enough to show the shape of something holstered beneath it. "We don't want trouble," the first man said, and his voice had dropped, gone flatter, the politeness sloughing off him like a costume he didn't need anymore now that the room had thinned out. Most of the other children already herded into the back classroom by a terrified teacher's aide. "We were told to bring the boy, that's all. Nobody has to get hurt. He's not going anywhere with you. That's not really your call to make, is it?" The man took a step closer, slow, deliberate, testing the distance, and Mara's body moved before her mind had fully caught up with the decision, grabbing the nearest thing within reach. A wooden block, heavy, corner-sharp, the kind of toy that had probably built 100 crooked towers that week. And she didn't think about what she was doing, she just swung it as hard as her arm could manage, catching the man across the temple with a crack that made Leo scream into the back of her shirt. The man staggered, more surprised than hurt, blood already welling along his hairline. And that surprise bought her exactly 2 seconds, which was exactly enough time for the door behind the second man to explode inward. Alessio came through it like something unleashed, and Mara had never seen him like this. Not once in 8 years of marriage, not in any of the careful, controlled versions of him she'd catalogued over the years. This was a different animal entirely. He had the second man by the collar before the man's hand finished moving toward his jacket, slammed him face first into the doorframe with a sound that made Mara's stomach turn, and when the man tried to come up swinging, Alessio drove a knee into his ribs that folded him in half and dropped him gasping to the floor. "Touch my son again," Alessio said, voice low and absolutely level despite the violence still vibrating off his shoulders, "and I will make sure it's the last thing you ever touch." The first man, blood running into his eyebrow now, lunged for Alessio's exposed side, and Mara screamed a warning that came out wordless and raw. But Alessio had already half-turned, already caught the man's wrist mid-swing and twisted it back at an angle that wasn't natural, that made the man's knees buckle and a sound tear out of him that wasn't quite human. Alessio drove him down onto a child's plastic table that splintered under the weight, sent crayons and construction paper scattering across the floor in a chaos of color, and pinned him there with a forearm across the throat. "Who sent you?" Alessio said. "Say his name." The man's eyes rolled toward the door, toward his unconscious or near-unconscious partner, toward anywhere but the question being asked of him. And Alessio pressed harder, and the man's face went the color of old brick. "Vincenzo," he choked out. It was Vincenzo. He said the boy needed to disappear before the council meeting. Said if his nephew couldn't be reasoned with, the leverage would have to be removed. Mira's blood went to ice. Leverage. Her son, 5.5 years old, gluing macaroni to paper plates 20 minutes ago, reduced to a single cold word in a man's mouth. Sirens were audible now, distant but closing, and Alessio's head came up at the sound, some calculation moving fast behind his eyes. He looked at the man pinned beneath his arm, looked at the door, looked at Mara with Leo still wrapped around her legs, shaking, silent now in the particular silent way children go when they understand on some animal level that something has gone very wrong in the adult world around them. "You're going to tell the police you tried to abduct a child on the orders of Vincenzo Romano," Alessio said, voice dropping into something colder, more deliberate than the rage from a moment ago. "You're going to tell them everything, or I promise you, what happens to you in a holding cell will make tonight feel like a kindness." The man nodded, frantic, blood and spit running down his chin. Alessio rose off him slowly, stepped back, and for one suspended moment the violence drained out of his posture, and what was left underneath was something closer to devastation. He crossed the wrecked room to where Mara stood, and he didn't reach for her, didn't reach for anything except Leo, kneeling down to his level with hands that were shaking now that the immediate threat had passed. "Hey, buddy. Hey, you're okay. I've got you." Leo turned his face out from Mara's side just enough to look at him, eyes huge and wet, and something in the boy's face crumpled at the sight of him, some instinct deeper than understanding, and he let go of his mother's legs and threw himself into Alessio's arms with the total unguarded trust only a child carries. Mara stood there, shaking, watching her son cry into the shoulder of a man whose family had just tried to take him, and the contradiction of it nearly buckled her knees. The police arrived in a wash of red and blue light, and the next hour dissolved into statements and questions, and a paramedic checking Leo over while Mara held his hand so tight her knuckles ached. And through all of it, Alessio stood a few feet away, jaw locked, eyes never leaving his son, making calls in low-clipped Italian that Mara couldn't fully follow, but understood the shape of regardless. War being declared, one phone call at a time. That night, after Leo had finally cried himself to sleep in a bed in the safe house, Alessio's people set up within 2 hours of leaving the daycare center. A converted compound an hour outside the city, with armed men at every entrance, Mara sat at a kitchen table she didn't recognize in a house she'd never been to, and Alessio sat across from her, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "This ends now," he finally said. "Tomorrow, I'm calling an emergency council session." With what proof? A coerced confession from a man who'll recant the second he's out of your sight. A doctor, too scared to testify. Castellano will testify. I made sure of that this afternoon before any of this happened. He's already given a sworn statement, recorded, witnessed by 2 council members I trust. And I have DNA evidence ordered the moment I confirmed Leo's age. The lab results come back tomorrow morning. DNA. Her stomach dropped. "You tested him without telling me?" "I had it run from a hair off his jacket the first day I saw him in the diner. I'm sorry. I needed to know, and I didn't trust myself not to do something reckless before I had proof." He met her eyes, unflinching despite the admission. "I won't apologize for protecting him, Mara. Not anymore. Not after today." She wanted to be angry. The anger was there, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, but it had nowhere to land because she understood, in the marrow of her bones, that he'd done exactly what she would have done in his position. "He had men inside that daycare," she said instead, voice cracking on the words. "Vincenzo had men close enough to know which building, which exact moment to strike. How long has he been watching us, Alessio? How long has he known where we are?" "Longer than I'd like to think about." His hands curled into fists on the table. "Which means he's been planning this since before I even arrived in that town. Which means finding you wasn't an accident on my end at all. He let me find you." The realization hit them both at the same moment, a cold, sick clarity. "He wanted you to find us," Mira said slowly. "He wanted you to bring Leo into the open, because as long as we were hidden, we weren't a threat he could remove cleanly. But the second you confirmed paternity, the second there was a child with a blood claim to challenge his own son's path to the council, he needed Leo gone before tomorrow's session, before there's any chance of DNA results entering the record." Alessio's voice had gone hollow, the full weight of it settling over him. "I led him straight to my own son." "You didn't know." "I should have. I know exactly what kind of man he is. I grew up watching him operate, and I still walked you both straight into his crosshairs." He dragged both hands down his face, and for a moment he looked older than she'd ever seen him, the careful armor of command stripped away to something closer to a frightened father. "I'm not letting him near that council session tomorrow without me standing between him and every person in that room. I don't care what it costs." "And if it costs your life? Then it costs my life." He looked at her, steady now despite everything. "I'm done running calculations that put anyone but Leo and you at the center of them." The admission sat heavy in the kitchen between them, and Mara felt something shift in her chest, some wall she'd spent 6 years reinforcing developing its first real crack. The council session convened at noon the next day in a building Mara had never seen. Marble floors and high windows and a long table around which sat 11 men and women whose faces she recognized only vaguely from old photographs Alessio had once shown her, lifetimes ago, in a different version of their marriage. She sat in the gallery with Leo's small hand locked in hers, two of Alessio's most trusted men flanking them, while Alessio stood at the head of the table and laid out, piece by piece, the conspiracy that had stolen 6 years of his life. Vincenzo sat near the far end, composed, dismissive, his face arranged into an expression of wounded patience that made Mara's skin crawl with how convincing it was. "This is theater," he said when Alessio finished. "A grieving man inventing a fantasy to explain why his wife abandoned him. I won't dignify it further." Dr. Castellano disagrees. Alessio nodded toward the door, and it opened to admit the thin gray doctor, flanked by two of Alessio's guards, his hands trembling, but his spine straighter than Mara had seen it in the clinic. "Tell them what you told me." Castellano's voice shook but didn't break as he laid out the falsified report, the payment, the years of silence bought with fear. Vincenzo's composed mask held through the first several sentences and then, almost imperceptibly, began to slip. "He's lying," Vincenzo said too quickly. "Paid to lie, no doubt, by my nephew, who clearly has lost all sense of... There's also this." Alessio set a folder on the table, and one of the council members nearest him opened it, scanned the contents, and went very still. "DNA confirmation. Processed this morning by an independent lab with no ties to either side of this family. Leo Romano is my biological son. Not a fabrication, not theater. Fact, on paper, irrefutable." The room had gone utterly silent. Vincenzo's face had drained of color. The mask, finally, completely gone, replaced by something raw and calculating underneath, eyes darting around the table as he ran whatever math was left to him. "And yesterday," Alessio continued, voice dropping into something lethal, "two of your men attempted to abduct that same child from his daycare center. One of them is currently in police custody, giving a full statement naming you directly as the man who ordered it." A murmur swept the table, low and immediate, 11 sets of eyes swinging toward Vincenzo with a weight that had nothing left of deference in it. Vincenzo's hand moved, slow, almost casual, toward the inside of his jacket, and Mara's breath caught in her throat, every instinct in her body screaming a warning a half-second before she understood exactly what was about to happen. Two of Alessio's men closed on Vincenzo before his hand cleared the jacket, one wrenching his arm back at an angle that made him cry out, the other stripping the weapon from his waistband in a single practiced motion and laying it on the table like evidence already entered into record. Vincenzo struggled for half a second, then went still, chest heaving, the last of his composure stripped away in front of 11 people who had spent decades deferring to him. "Sit him down," Alessio said, and his voice carried none of the heat Mara expected, only a flat, exhausted finality. They forced him back into his chair. The room held its silence a moment longer, and then the eldest woman at the table, a sharp-eyed matriarch named Donata, who Mara vaguely remembered from a wedding photograph in another lifetime, spoke into it. "You drew a weapon in a council session." Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Whatever doubt remained in this room, Vincenzo, you've just buried it yourself. I built this family's fortune for 30 years. Vincenzo's voice cracked, desperation finally breaking through the cultivated calm. "Everything you have, every dollar in this room, runs through systems I designed. You'd take the word of a forged confession and a frightened doctor over 3 decades of loyalty? We'd take the word of DNA evidence and a child nearly stolen from a daycare center," Donata said. "Loyalty built on murder threats and falsified medical records isn't loyalty, Vincenzo. It's a debt we didn't know we owed, and we're done paying it." The vote took less than 10 minutes. Mara sat in the gallery with Leo's head now drooping against her shoulder. The boy worn past the point of fear into a kind of stunned exhaustion, and watched 11 hands rise one by one to strip Vincenzo Romano of every title, every asset, every shred of standing he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. He was led out in restraints, his composure finally, completely gone, shouting something about bloodlines and rightful inheritance that dissolved into incoherence by the time the doors closed behind him. Alessio didn't watch him go. He turned instead, found Mara's eyes across the room, and the look on his face wasn't triumph. It was something closer to grief, the particular hollow exhaustion of a man who'd won and lost in the same motion, who'd gained 6 years of truth and lost 6 years of a relationship with an uncle he'd trusted since boyhood. He crossed the room and knelt in front of Leo, who blinked up at him with eyes gone glassy from too much adrenaline and not enough sleep. "It's over, buddy," Alessio said quietly. "Nobody's going to come for you again. I promise you that." Leo studied him with the unfiltered seriousness only children manage, and then asked the question that had apparently been sitting in him through all of it. Through the daycare, through the safe house, through a council session he'd been too young to understand but old enough to feel the weight of. "Are you really my dad?" The room around them had thinned, council members filing out, leaving the three of them in a wash of late afternoon light through the high windows. Alessio glanced at Mara, a question in his eyes, and asking for permission that she hadn't expected from him and that nearly broke her completely. She nodded. "Yeah," Alessio said, voice rough. "I really am." Leo's small face did something complicated, processing, and then he launched himself forward into Alessio's arms with the same total unguarded trust he'd shown the day before in the wreckage of the daycare center. And Alessio caught him and held him like something he'd been carrying his whole life without knowing the weight had a name. Mara watched them from a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself, and felt something in her chest finally, after 6 years, begin to loosen. The weeks that followed moved slower than Mara expected, and she was grateful for the slowness, for the chance to breathe after years of running on a current that never let up. Alessio didn't push. That surprised her most of all, given everything she knew about him, given the man who'd built an empire on getting what he wanted through sheer force of will. He found her a house. Not his house, not the mansion she remembered from the early years of their marriage, but a modest place with a yard and good light and a kitchen big enough for the three of them to exist in without crowding each other, and he made it clear without being asked that the deed was in her name alone. "I'm not trying to buy anything," he told her the day he handed her the keys, standing on the front porch with his hands shoved in his pockets like a man who'd forgotten how to stand still in front of her. "I just don't want you sleeping somewhere that isn't fully yours, not after everything." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just turned the key over in her palm and felt the weight of it settle into something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was no longer pure suspicion either. He came twice a week, exactly as promised, sometimes more if Leo asked for him, and she watched the relationship between father and son build itself slowly, awkwardly, in the unglamorous currency of bedtime stories read wrong on purpose for laughs, of scraped knees iced at the kitchen table, of a man who'd spent his entire adult life issuing commands, learning, instead, to crouch down to a 5-year-old's eye level and actually listen. It was harder between her and Alessio. The trust that had been burned out of her over 6 years didn't grow back overnight, and there were nights she lay awake in the new house listening for cars that slowed outside, old habits that refused to die just because the immediate threat had been removed. Alessio never pushed past what she offered. He showed up when he said he would. He answered every question she asked, fully, even the ones that clearly cost him something to answer. He stopped, gradually, being the careful, controlled stranger from the diner booth, and started being something closer to the boy she'd fallen in love with 8 years earlier, before the families and the obligations had buried him under armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it wasn't his actual skin. 3 months after the council session, she opened the door to find him standing on the porch in jeans and a plain gray shirt, none of the tailored suits, holding a folder she recognized immediately because she'd handed identical ones to nervous parents 100 times in another life. "What is this?" she asked, though she already knew, already felt her pulse pick up in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time. "There's a building 2 streets over from Leo's new school. Empty storefront, good light, decent acoustics if you knock through the back wall." He held the folder out to her, and his hand wasn't quite steady. "I know you used to teach piano before everything, before the family, before the running. I found old recital programs and a box of things you left behind. I thought maybe—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not asking you to take it. I'm telling you it's there if you want it. No strings. The deed's already filed in your name." She stood in the doorway with the folder in her hands, throat too tight to speak, looking at a man who'd spent years building an empire of fear and was now standing on her porch offering her a piano studio with no strings attached and something in her chest cracked open that she'd kept sealed since the night Vincenzo had stood in her bedroom and told her to disappear. "Why?" she finally managed. "Because you lost 6 years you should have spent doing the thing you loved. And I can't give those years back to you, but I can give you this." His eyes held hers, steady, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen since before the wedding, before the families, before any of it. "I'm not trying to win you back, Mara. I know that's not something I get to buy. I just want you to have your life back, whatever shape that takes, with me or without me." She opened the music school 6 weeks later, a modest sign over the door reading simply, "Morrow Music," half her real name and half a tribute to the years she'd spent answering to something else. And on opening day, Leo sat at the upright piano in the front window, picking out a simple scale with the same fierce concentration he brought to everything, while Alessio stood near the back of the room, watching both of them with an expression Mara had started, slowly, cautiously, to let herself believe was permanent. It was nearly a year later, on an ordinary Tuesday evening with the smell of dinner still hanging in the kitchen, and Leo asleep upstairs in a room painted the blue he'd insisted on for his 6th birthday, that Alessio found her on the back porch, looking out at a yard that had finally, after everything, started to feel like it belonged to her. He didn't say much. He rarely did anymore. Not the big things, not the things that mattered most. He just sat down beside her on the step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and after a while he reached over and took her hand, slow, asking rather than taking, and she let him, watched their fingers laced together in the fading light, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for the better part of a decade. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that the day you found us would be the worst day of my life." Was it? She considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she'd learned to turn everything over now, slow and careful, no longer in a hurry to outrun her own life. "No," she said finally. "I think it might have been the day everything finally stopped being a lie." Alessio's thumb moved gently across her knuckles, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, because there was nothing left that needed saying. Not with words, not on a porch in a town she'd chosen with her eyes closed years ago and never expected to call home. Inside the house, through the open window, she could hear nothing but the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the settling creak of old wood, ordinary sounds, safe sounds, the sounds of a life finally allowed to be unremarkable. Upstairs, Leo slept soundly in a room with his father's eyes looking back at him from the mirror every morning and no reason left to wonder why. 6 years of running had taught Mara how to disappear. It took the year that followed to teach her something harder, something she hadn't known she still had the capacity to learn. How to stay. How to trust the ground beneath her feet, not to give way. How to let a man who had once been a stranger in a diner booth become, slowly and without force, the steady center of a life she had once been certain she'd have to build entirely alone. The lullaby that had once been their only secret, the one Leo had hummed without ever knowing where it came from, became something else now, a song she taught her students on quiet afternoons, a song Alessio sometimes caught himself humming under his breath while doing the dishes, no longer a fragment of a buried past, but simply a part of an ordinary, unburied life. And on the back porch, in the last of the evening light, two people who had lost everything to a lie finally let themselves believe, fully and without reservation, in the truth they'd built instead.